All right, it's 3 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and start. So you can be respectful of your time, realizing that a few people will be signing on as they can. Just a reminder that this session will be recorded or is recording right now and will be posted along with the other materials on our Comprehensive Literacy Webinar Series webpage, the same page that you used to register for this webinar today. So all materials will be posted there. As soon as possible anyway. My name is Jill Nogueras. I'm the K-12 English Coordinator here at the Virginia Department of Education, and I just want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. I have my colleagues also on the line, Carmen Keurig, our Elementary English and Reading Specialist, and Colleen Cassida, our Middle School English Specialist, and the three of us are going to walk you through some best practices for literacy learning in place. Now that the majority of us find ourselves in some sort of remote learning environment or providing additional supports for students once they get home if we're in a hybrid environment, whatever that may look like. I do know we did open this to the public, so I have a feeling that we have not only educators and supervisors on the line, but a lot of parents as well. So we're excited to have you join us today, and we're hoping that we share some information that will guide you and encourage you as we move forward in this unknown territory that is the 2020-2021 school year. And I'm going to cross my fingers that all technology is working properly, and someone will let me know if my slides are not moving forward. But just looking at our agenda today, we want to review just some best practices in literacy, and then look at some methods and best practices for virtual learning and what that might look like for our students of English and reading, how we might plan for instruction, what our focus areas for instruction should be, and then additional resources and additional upcoming opportunities for you all or to share with educators and parents in your communities. Just a quick reminder that we are in the 2021 school year, and while we were closed last spring, the governor closed the schools for the COVID-19 emergency school closure. So we were in a pause and kind of reflect and review mode for the end of last school year. For the 2021 school year, all school divisions must provide new instruction to all students. So we are not going back 10 weeks and recovering that missed instruction. We are folding that into our new instruction this year and moving forward with the current grade level that students find themselves in. We do have some links here that will be linked for you when you get the presentation that kind of reviews the instructional plan guidance that's there, the submission link that school divisions are using to submit their plans to the state of Virginia, and just a preview of what that information may look like. So depending on your role, this slide may or may not pertain to you, but just know for everyone on the line, we are talking about new instruction for students this year. And then today, right now, we're going to kind of transition into this idea of best practices for literacy instruction. So I'm going to turn this over to Carmen so that she can handle the next few slides.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. We are going to start today by reviewing some best practices for instruction. And if you've attended some of our webinars last year, some of these best practices will not be new, but just looking through a new lens with the understanding that best practices in the classroom and best practices or instruction are best practices for any kind of learning, no matter where we are. So just looking through these best practices in a new lens and how can we help students have access to these when they aren't necessarily within the four walls of our classroom. So if we won't go into probably as much detail with these as we did in previous webinars. So if you wanted to listen to those, there's a link at the end of this webinar that will take you to the webpage that has all of those linked and recorded. So you can kind of listen to those in detail. But just as a reminder to kind of help us refresh our brains on best practices in general, and we will start with elementary and then we'll go through secondary. So first of all, just thinking about what are those in elementary skills and knowledge that are critical to children's comprehension. So thinking about word level skills, vocabulary knowledge, and oral language skills, building those broad concepts with students and building their background knowledge. And then those knowledge and abilities that are required to comprehend. building their thinking and reasoning skills, and then motivation. Motivation to understand their goals and motivation to kind of work towards them. So not necessarily kind of what motivates students in general, but that motivation to understand and work towards something. And so then we will go to the next slide. Still remaining in elementary, thinking about in those early elementary years, strong phonics, excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied. Strong phonics instruction. And just like we said before, best practice with strong phonics instruction in the classroom is the same best practice that we want to use, whether they're through a learning packet, whether they're in a hybrid model with us, or whether they're strictly virtual. So being explicit and systematic, telling students exactly what we want them to learn, having those readiness skills. If we know that fluency with letters and sounds, not just knowing letters and sounds, but being fluent with that, blending, segmenting, and manipulating sounds are strong predictors of third grade reading. Success, how do we help students have access to those in any type of learning environment, whether it's recording videos or doing live instruction with that, or sending home instructions for parents, or doing it over a phone call, whatever that may be. It is a best practice that we want to continue. Following a scope and sequence, going from more simpler skills to more complex, focusing on blending. Dictation, helping students kind of practice those phonics skills in a written form. Building their word awareness, focusing on high frequency words, and then helping them practice those phonics phonics skills in a connected text. And then building their vocabulary and background knowledge so that when they're reading new words, they always have some background to connect it back to. And we'll move to the next slide, which continues with those foundational reading skills, which we've covered previously, but just to kind of refresh our memories on them. Teaching students academic language skills, including inferential language, narrative language, and vocabulary knowledge. Helping students understand, what does it sound like when we're telling a story, and what does it sound like when we're talking about something that's not kind of right there or concrete. And then number 2, developing an awareness of segments of speech sound, really helping students build their speech sounds and understand all of the letter combinations that are connected to those speech sounds. And then decoding, really focusing on decoding with those foundational reading skills, analyzing different word parts, and then kind of doing the reciprocal of that and practice them in writing as well. And then ensuring that students read connected text every day is still something important to focus on when they are with us or when they're learning kind of beyond those 4 walls. So really kind of brainstorming on how we can give them access to that beyond our classroom. And then we'll move on to comprehension. So those were kind of a strong focus on foundational skills, but when thinking about comprehension, best practices being really teaching those comprehension strategies. And once we've introduced those comprehension strategies, we kind of begin to intermingle them together. So teaching students how to wonder, how to ask questions, how to visualize, really kind of about reading kind of that, we talk about mental math, kind of that mental reading, how to visualize what they're reading in their head, how to monitor and know when they need to go back, inferring and retelling, and then how to kind of use one to help to aid in the other. How do I visualize what I've just read in order to retell? And then really exposing to students to lots of different types of genres and of reading. So really exposing them to narrative and informational, even though we may not have them specifically identifying those in early grades, we can expose them to them so that when they get up into the upper elementary grades and they need to identify those, that it's just that much easier. So having those conversations about, well, this tells a story, it has characters, and exposing them to that vocabulary, or this really kind of showed us how something happens in order in a sequence. Exposing them to those types of stories, teaching them that vocabulary, and having conversations about that. And then to continue on with comprehension instruction, using questioning strategies that really kind of build from some locate and recall type of questions, those lower level questions to those higher level questions, really kind of navigating students through those levels of questions to guide the conversation. And then being selective about the type of text that you're picking with students. Picking text with rich content, strong organization, word choice and sentence structure, and really thinking about what is the goal of your lesson. What is it that by the end of this 3-minute video, or by the end of this this lesson, this packet I've written up, what is it that I want them to be able to know and do, and looking for books or passages or whatever it is that kind of meets that. And then thinking about the age of your learner. That's a huge piece of it. What is the age of the learner? What's going to interest them and keep them engaged in the content? And then the next one is huge, especially when they are not with us, but establishing that engaging environment that's going to keep them motivated in that comprehension. So helping them discover the purpose and benefits, helping them see themselves as readers, giving them choices. I know that's something that's hard to do with limited access to text, but maybe it's not the text that they have a choice with, but how can we allow them choice within that text maybe? And then giving them opportunity to collaborate with peers, also something important, and how can we maybe support that when they're not in our classrooms. And then something that we always want to remember, even when they're not with us, is that the standards of learning for English are not written to kind of go by the strand. We have the strand of reading, writing, research, and communication, and multimodal literacies, but they are written to be interwoven together and integrated together. We don't necessarily say, okay, we're going to start our reading unit and we're going to start our writing unit, but how can we make learning authentic, and that we are writing about what we're reading, we're communicating and writing about what we're researching, and then we're communicating all through everything we're doing. So we're going to review a few best practices that support the integration of these English strands. So we'll move to the next one. So in reading, when we're thinking about selecting vocabulary from authentic text, kind of going between fiction and nonfiction to build understanding, really building a text-rich environment with a variety of text and media. So the environment that we're thinking of is a little different than our normal environment, but how can we build whatever environment they are in with rich text and rich media? And then again, allowing student choice whenever possible, that we're continuing writing as a process for a variety of purposes, even when students are not with us. Continuing regular writing conferences, whether that's a Zoom session or a phone call, to say, hey, tell me about what you're writing, or even maybe a written email kind of back and forth, or whatever it is, whatever the mode is that your division is utilizing, that you're continuing to have that conversation about student writing. And the use of portfolios, that you're collecting student writing and students are able to see their growth and to go back and kind of, oh, I could add this here or I can add this there, and really have that collection of their work. And that we're communicating and sharing what we're researching all throughout the school year. Once we kind of introduce some of those research techniques and those research standards, that it just becomes commonplace that we're always wondering and gathering information on new things. And even when students are kind of in their school environment that is not in our four walls, that we're still using those text-dependent questions, having students dive deep into text, the use of inference-based questions, text-based vocabulary, that students are responding to what they're reading, and thinking that there's a writing component in every lesson. That's something that we think when we think about feedback and kind of those check-ins on what students are doing, those writing components can be very helpful, but just as long as they're used in that purposeful, intentional way of responding to reading, reflecting on what they're learning, and things of those nature. And then there's frequent research components with the access to media that some of your divisions are using. That will be, it's a really rich place that students can dive into that. And then the use of paired text, still continuing with pairing text together, using media that can support a text you've read, or having students watch a video before you read a text to kind of build that background knowledge. Or if you're focusing on a common theme or topic that hits history and social science or science content. I know that time is of the essence these days with the content work. So pairing text together is a great way to get some of that content in as well. And then comparing and contrasting text to really kind of hit that highest level of thinking and questioning. And so one of the most natural and authentic ways to kind of integrate the 4 strands of the English standards of learning is really thinking through this idea of a thematic approach, a thematic unit, kind of choosing a topic or a theme that's age appropriate for your students, and then really thinking about all the text and media that could support that. And as far as lesson planning goes and unit planning, really thinking about all the standards that maybe your students have already learned, what can I hit during this unit, what will be review, and providing opportunities for shared and independent reading, and then modeling the writing process throughout the unit for those authentic writing opportunities, because it's around a topic that interests them. It's around a topic, kind of a social context that they can write about something that will make the world a better place, whether it's a brochure or a pamphlet, or really kind of modeling that for them. And then think as we kind of get into the upper elementary and even lower elementary, we want students to read every day, having those opportunities to read. And when they're having those extended access to extended pieces of text and that grade level material, fiction and nonfiction, and that they're analyzing across multiple texts altogether. So read. The title kind of says it all for that one, but continuing those daily opportunities for grade level text. And we know, we've said this before, but when we say opportunities for grade level text, it doesn't necessarily mean that you just send a student off to kind of read something that's going to frustrate them, but that we scaffold it. And that once you get to know your learners, really kind of spending this initial time with them to kind of think about, get to know them and build those relationships, but thinking about what scaffolds they will need when kind of giving them access to that text. So what is it that's going to help them access that grade level piece of text? Will it be supporting vocabulary, maybe pre-teaching some vocabulary, or giving some picture clues to some vocabulary as they're getting ready to read? Maybe annotating the text. Is it numbering the paragraphs that's going to help them, or just giving them some annotations as they read that might help them, or teaching them how to kind of annotate their own text that may give them access to that text. Using, kind of planning some questions along the way that will help scaffold their reading, allowing time for reflection and discussion. So wherever they are, whether it's live with you on a video or in your classroom or at home, really allowing time for reflection, whether it's telling a family member or telling the teacher and kind of talking through something in preparation for a written reflection, or maybe it's a written reflection in preparation for a discussion. Really kind of allowing that time for that learning to stick through that reflection. And then providing lots of hours a week for independent reading, accessing the grade level text, locating complicated sentence structures. If you're looking through a passage and there's some of those sentence structures that are a little bit more difficult than others, thinking about a way that you may pre-teach that before you give them the text. And then just being explicit with students, telling them what you want them to know, telling them which parts may be tricky, and let's tackle that together. So just being explicit as a scaffold along the way, and students will take that as a challenge, and they will always rise to that occasion if we're explicit with them. So those are a lot of kind of some of those literacy supports, and I'm going to let Jill take you into the forgotten R.
Yes, we spend a lot of time talking about writing instruction and the importance of writing instruction in a student's literacy development. And to be honest, becoming better writers helps us become better readers, and vice versa. So the two kind of go hand in hand, and we're always meant to be together, but oftentimes get separated out or lost in the shuffle, or something that gets pushed to the back burner because of the many other challenges and priorities on our plates. So we just kind of wanted to quickly, just as a reminder before we get into this whole virtual idea, just kind of talk about the fact that writing instruction is just as important now as ever, even if it needs to take on just a different look in this new environment, whether that's we're asking students to build off of smaller pieces. I know we have a lot of younger students who are finding themselves using laptops and Chromebooks without even understanding the keyboard yet. So that kind of slows down that writing development. And so maybe we need to be a little bit more flexible in how we kind of look at those writing samples, or maybe we are having our students write by hand and having an adult take a picture to submit a picture of the student's written work to the educator or caregiver, or possibly we are building those sentences and then just asking our students to expand them, and maybe they need to put in the descriptive word or whatever the case may be, so that the challenges of not knowing how to use a keyboard doesn't get in the way of learning how to write. So just kind of thinking about how we can bring writing instruction into this virtual environment, and thinking about what this looks like, especially in elementary school. So thinking about how to have effective writers in a virtual classroom. And that includes providing daily time for students to write, whatever that looks like. Like I said, whether it's expanding sentences or writing a piece and taking a picture of it, or maybe collaborating with another partner on a Google Doc or something, but giving them that time to see this is part of what we do, even if it's just to write a response about something that you talked about in whole group, or a funny story that they read in class, or to ask questions about what they think is going to happen in a science experiment. Just showing them that while we are on a computer, we are still writing. And then teaching students to use the writing process for a variety of purposes. We don't just do finished final essays when we're writing for a teacher, but what are some other situations where we would want to go through the writing process because we want to revise and rework our structure and our language and think about what we're trying to get out based on whoever our audience may be. And then this idea about students becoming fluent with handwriting, spelling, sentence construction, typing, and word processing. That is such a complex recommendation right there, just to think about what that means and how to do handwriting and spelling and writing, and then move that over to word processing as students get older. But younger and younger, they are kind of working with word processing now. So this is something that Carmen likes to discuss a lot, about the idea that students will write what they have the words for. So if they are in a situation where, you know, they don't know how to write the bigger word, the more descriptive word, then they're not going to write it at all. They'll choose a much smaller word that they can manage, but then that changes what they're actually trying to express. So taking the time and building in that time to work on the handwriting and the spelling and the vocabulary, so that they feel like they can communicate what they have to share, so that we don't lose that communication from them. And then creating an engaged community of writers. And your community of writers may look very different this year, but there are so many ways that we can incorporate writing this year that I hope we can put some pieces in place to make that successful for all, because it is such an important piece of both reading and writing for our students to become writers. And before I turn this over to Colleen to talk about secondary, I just kind of want to show you just a visual. I don't necessarily need to spend time reading it to you, but to show you the differences between when writing is assigned to students and something they are supposed to do on their own, by themselves, after school, in isolation, more like how that's presented, versus when teachers are actually taking the time to instruct the writing and go through the process with the students, and how that actually changes and impacts outcomes. So we want to be more on this right-hand category where students are taught and not just assigned. And I think that in the past, we've been kind of in situations where we've had time to assign the writing because we have other things we need to do. But I think we have some time now where we can really get into the teaching of writing as we have these conversations with students, as we're showing them these writing skills and strategies that we're not just talking about. We're actually able to get on the computer and show them these things. And then again, like I talked about earlier, with these models and maybe sentence frames or whatever the case may be, determined by the age of your learner, you might be able to expand some of those so that, again, we're not getting completely frustrated by the keyboarding part of learning right now, but that we can actually expand thoughts and expand ideas through our writing if some of the writing is sort of done for us already with our younger learners. So, and then just showing them that it's a recursive process. I could probably change this PowerPoint 15 more times every time I look at it. There's always something that we can revise and improve upon as we're going through things, and show them that. And I think especially in this environment, we have the opportunity to show them that we are human too, and that we can improve in our learning alongside them. So this is another opportunity to kind of point that out as we're building those important relationships in our classrooms this fall. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Colleen for a little bit to talk about secondary best practices, and then we'll get into some practices for virtual learning.
Thanks, Jill. Good afternoon, everyone. So now, we'll look at how literacy practices, how the foundational skills evolve and build as students move into the secondary level. So we know that as students grapple more with academic reading, this requires specialized reading strategies to access those complex texts. So we're going to look at what the research says, and that it's recommended that teachers model and show students how to read within those different academic disciplines. So when authors write for different audiences and purposes, their structures and styles change. So we want to make sure that students are aware and of that change based on the purpose for writing and the purpose for reading. And there it is again, that combination of writing and reading. It's important for content area teachers to model this for our students and how to read and analyze text written for those different contents. And that is not just a role for the English teacher at the secondary level, but that is a collective responsibility for all of our teachers. And then the second one there about integration of multiple and social literacies. So as we know in this current situation and always, technology and social media is just changing by the day. And so it's changed the definition of literacy in the last few decades. So text comes in such a variety of forms that we need to show students how to interact with all forms, to include bias, validity of sources, and authors' credibility of sources, and also how to put those different texts together to strengthen an argument or point. And so we get into next, orchestration of engagement and motivation. So adolescent readers need sustained experiences with a variety of diverse texts and multiple genres and structures. And that motivation and engagement is increased when students have choice over the text that they are reading. And of course, we have mentioned this already, and it will be something that continues to come up in this webinar, that students need choice and voice in what they read in order to become the lifelong readers that we want them to be. And that is something that we have to keep in mind as we're trying to navigate where students are in learning recovery and moving forward with new material this year. And 4, appreciation of multicultural perspectives and cultures. So multicultural literacy is the seeing, the thinking, reading, writing, listening, and discussing all of these components in ways that critically confront and bridge those social, cultural, and personal differences. Inclusion of culturally diverse texts allows for students to see themselves in the text and embrace these similarities and differences of those around them. And that's really important, that we offer students depth and breadth in their literacy development. So many of you have heard of the concept of text. We've talked about that with mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. So we want to consider how students see themselves. How do they identify and have empathy with others, and how can these texts act as bridges and doorways to access the worlds that are different from their own? And this is a component of learning that's really so essential right now, given that we are experiencing, similarities being all in this unknown situation, but that we could be potentially closed off from experiencing other cultures and viewpoints due to the current circumstances. So then we get into looking at what research also supports, that adolescent readers really need to grow as thinkers, readers, and writers. And so thinking about thinking, how often do we ask students to synthesize and determine which strategies really help them that we're teaching them, and how they can engage with and tackle a piece of text? We only see this transfer of this skill happen when we ask students to think about a text on their own. That transfer won't occur when they are only reading and analyzing a text that adults have determined and dictated for them to use. And so that kind of goes back to what Jill was talking about, assigning versus teaching. So to be successful and be actual contributors to our communities, we want our students they need the space and time to learn how to recognize bias, credible sources, and how to determine when to believe what they're reading. And given the various learning spaces and platforms, it's important to build in time for reflective thinking, being able to articulate their own thoughts on what they've read and explain what they think. And that goes back to tying in reflective time for writing and discussion. And so text structure goes hand in hand with that writing. So we always want to remember to incorporate them together. Next slide. So when we consider the different opportunities to assess our students' ability to analyze and reach deeper understanding, assessments should focus on those bigger concepts and metacognitive ability. And like the research says here, we need to create assessments that help students focus the larger purpose and big ideas of the curriculum and on metacognitive strategies for thinking during literacy acts. So, that's something that plays into that meaningful assessment. And then access, choice, and volume of reading. So access to books at school. I know a lot of divisions are incorporating book access with meal distribution. So that is something that's very helpful. But at home, in the community, what does this look like? What opportunities do we have to increase access or get the word out about the importance of access to books? Because that's a conversation that really is recommended to be ongoing within school and division communities, to update students and families with information about how to access books and where to get reading materials. So within the instructional day, it's important to dedicate that time to read in school, whether we are in brick and mortar or we are whatever learning in place looks like. And it shows that students will not just magically start reading at home on their own if they don't practice those habits during the school day. This is a chart from Kylene Beers and Robert Probst's work on disrupting thinking. And this is just showing you how it reflects the power of just adding an extra 10 minutes of independent reading a day to increase word knowledge and literacy. So as you can see, making time for reading, no matter what learning in place looks like, is key in the development and progression of literacy. And building relationships to build better readers, that's so important, right? We are, as we know, a skills-based course. So we have the opportunity to build units of study around essential questions that require students to critically think about a topic that resonates with them. So to ensure this thinking happens, we can, build relationships by getting to know what interests our students, what current events and topics are important to them. Students can learn to summarize, draw conclusions, analyze text structure, organization, and author's purpose from any text. So variety really is the key here. And we can always include whole class selections to support a model of what that looks like. We can use and incorporate poems, articles, a chunk of a book. But what are they doing when they are in a text themselves, when they read independently in our classes? And how can we tap into their natural curiosity for that inquiry to help scaffold and support their learning and independence? So taking the time to include opportunities where you can find out about students and their interests is not time wasted right now. This, especially in where we have to hurdle over a digital platform anyways, this provides that motivation for meaningful themes and units of study.
Okay, so now we're going to kind of switch over now that we've spoken about just some overall literacy best practices. We're going to now kind of switch gears and talk about virtual instruction, like what this might look like for a virtual platform in a virtual classroom. So this is just kind of an overall kind of scope of understanding. And we did collaborate with our fine arts coordinator, who is one of our digital platform experts on virtual learning, to use some of these materials and to kind of gather information that would be helpful to all of you. So I did want to make sure that I included her in a little shout out there. So thank you, Kelly. But moving forward, talking about face-to-face versus virtual learning. There has been way more research out there than you would even think, because a lot of people think that we're just kind of in an emergency environment right now, but there's actually a lot of research, hundreds of studies that have compared the idea of computer-based learning with face-to-face instruction. And it seems to be, no matter where you go looking, it's that good instructional methods result in learning, whether those methods are delivered virtually or in person, which is why we wanted to spend time going over some of those instructional best practices. Because if we can get over the hurdle of the virtual platform, good teaching is good teaching and will result in student learning. So good instruction relies on a good teacher using good instructional methods and then tweaking those to our new environment. Not going to read these to you, but the idea of virtual instruction, typically you've probably heard recently the idea of synchronous instruction and asynchronous instruction, and different divisions, even different schools and grade levels are approaching this in different methods. And I know some school divisions are trying to offer both, so that there is synchronous live instruction going on during what we would consider the normal school day, but then asynchronous opportunities for students to learn or go back and rewatch a video or practice a skill later in the evening or over a weekend. So both models are currently being demonstrated across the Commonwealth at this time, and with various levels of success. So I'm not sure what situation you find yourselves in at the moment, but these are the methods that are out there. So we just kind of wanted to get that vocabulary out there for your reference later on. But to think about it, because I know that even if you are in a synchronous situation, you do have the opportunity to provide some asynchronous resources. And whether that's that you're creating a video that your students can watch whenever they have time, or you're just explaining a homework assignment. So you've created a little video to show how to attack a certain web page and how to fill something out, and just give instructions that we normally would stand in the front of the class and model and demonstrate for students that we don't have the opportunity to now. You might be in a situation where you might find that some of the stuff in the material that you're covering could be done synchronously or asynchronously, even better. So kind of thinking about like when to use what, I think you need to ask yourself these questions. So what interaction is needed for students to understand what you're trying to get across? What will the feedback look like? Will it be oral? Will it be written? Will it be something stamped digitally on their papers? Whatever the case may be. What kind of informal observation and assessments are available for your use? What are you trying to do? How are you going to see that students are learning? Whether that's a formative assessment or just thumbs up, thumbs down in terms of looking at students, making eye contact and figuring out what you can do to understand if students are understanding you. What is the product and outcome of the learning experience? What are you trying to get across? And that might help you determine whether or not this is something you should do live or something that you should have a recording of. And what do you want your students to know, understand, and be able to do after the lesson? And is this content new, or is it review of something more complex or complicated that they will need to further their learning? And then also, one that we really need to keep at the forefront of our mind all the time, what are the student and caregiver needs in terms of being able to support this learning, whether that's at home, in a childcare facility, in a church basement? The community has really rallied around our students here in Virginia, and we have so many strange learning environments happening, whether that's a gymnastics center or a karate place, whatever the case may be. But what is going to support the adults who are helping those students learn, especially if they have several students from different grade levels and different teachers? So when you're thinking about what's going to provide the most successful for students, we do need to also think about those caregivers and the adults that are helping them at home that may not have access to the material in the synchronous environment. So thinking about student success, we want to talk about climate and culture, systems and structures, communication, learning targets, and making learning visible. So those are kind of the 5 things that we're going to discuss in this next section. So thinking about creating a climate and culture based on trust, which is such a difficult thing to comprehend if you're meeting students for the first time on a computer and your students are meeting you for the first time on a computer. So thinking about what is necessary for that, we really want to talk about empathy. And empathy can be, on many levels here, but extending that to students and families who are experiencing so many different challenges, whether it's your high school students who are unavailable because during the school day, they are monitoring their elementary siblings' learning environments while parents are at work and needing to do their own work in the evening, or, maybe internet's a factor, or just having an adult around to support is a factor. But always start through the lens of the understanding that families and students are doing the best they can with what they have in their current situation. Always that benefit of the doubt and understanding coming from a good place. We've got to start from a good place and not just look at why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z, but let's look at what you are doing and what I can do to support you moving forward. So you will see that during this presentation, there's a lot of links to different articles and professional subscriptions that we've put in here for you too. So if you want to go in and look at these more specifically later yourselves, you're able to, because we just have highlights in our presentation today. So coming from that educator lens, how do I create a positive class culture in a remote learning setting? Start by getting to know your students. And what I think we've all come to realize for the school division say that started this week is that this week's a little crazy. Everybody's getting to learn their students, and it's a little chaotic, and everybody wants to talk, and everybody has something to share and say, and there's glitches. But what can we do to get to know our students? We have all year to teach them, but they're not going to learn if we don't take the time to get to know them as people. So make your classroom a safe space for mistakes. Show them, we as educators, as the adults, fumbling through this whole thing, we're making mistakes left and right ourselves. This isn't actually a difficult one to try to do, because you're probably going to model it yourselves. I do daily. But show them, like, we make mistakes here. We're all learning together. So they realize that they can make mistakes. Model for them how to respond to diverse ideas, opinions, and beliefs in student interactions. This whole classroom culture is really hard to build when students are just over a screen and there's no eye contact. There's no social cues that are happening that would normally happen in a classroom. So show them how to respond to one another, which basically follows our communication strand anyway, about how do we handle when we don't agree with a person who has different ideas from ourselves. Model that for them. Be prepared to respond to promote constructive dialogue about, and to support project themes about race and social justice. We're talking current events now. This is here to stay. This is what we're discussing. This is what we're trying to change and model for our students, and just be prepared that what's on their minds comes out of their mouths. So how can we engage in those conversations in a way that's productive, and polite and kind of honors everybody in the classroom. And then use live class sessions to collaboratively develop community agreements, whether those are norms or behaviors, or my own daughter they have classroom jobs so that everybody kind of has a position and feels like they are part of something. What kind of structures could we have for that class community so that we can engage with our students and build positive relationships? Because if we don't do this step first, the rest of it doesn't really matter. They will have tuned us out. So thinking about systems and structures that will support all students. And that is such a big topic, which I know we have only a few minutes to discuss, but again, we have all the materials for you to go in if you would like to do a deep dive later. So how do I create a positive class culture in a remote learning setting? Clearly communicate your norms, routines, and expectations. They also need to practice with those before diving into class content. I think back to elementary school where we practiced lining up at the door and we practiced walking down the hall, and just all of those pieces, we kind of had to show students what our expectations were for moving around a building when they're 5, 6, 7 years old. Well, those same 5, 6, 7-year-olds are trying to figure out how to meet the expectations that we're setting for them in a virtual environment. So without tying the secondary piece of the content to whatever task we're asking them to do, just have them practice what it is we're asking them to do without adding that layer of complexity. We can get into content later. Let's show them how we're going to do these routines and follow these structures so that they can meet them. And once they have that down, then we can add on the content. Set office hours and be present, visible, and available during those times. That might be a time that if parents know that those are your office hours, they might be able to pause their work and make a phone call to you because they know that they can reach you. So make sure that you're present and visible and available for students, parents, and caregivers during this time. And then create a predictable lesson structure so that it helps students develop a routine that works for them. It helps them figure out what is happening next. And we are going to move on to communication, which Colleen is going to cover. So I'm going to turn that back over to her.
Yeah, so just like you said, Jill, communication is so important. So if we move to the next slide, we can talk about some key components to communication. So it's important in conveying the expectations and goals for the lesson, keeping instructions clear. One suggestion might be to pre-record the instructions and break them down, or you could create a script to read prior to teaching to ensure that the essential information and directions are transparent and students know exactly what is being asked of them. And that they're able to what they're able to do by the end of the lesson. So providing students with the criteria for success for whatever the assignment or task may be is key in creating that fluid communication and understanding the purpose for learning. Limit excessive wording when using written communication. So pre-recorded video directions can be so helpful to use for this platform as often as you can. Be sure to include face-to-face opportunities though for students and families to ask those clarifying questions, and consider how much email communication students are receiving all the time. So trying to reduce overload for students with emails, especially if they are struggling. Sometimes, they may reach out through email to express a concern, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to return an email response. It might work better through a virtual meeting or a phone call to avoid that additional stress or frustration with having to translate the meaning of what's going on. And then this environment quality is definitely more important than quantity. So students should recognize that when you are communicating with them, it is for a reason and that it is clear and to the point. And remember that we always want to proofread written information to be sure that the language is student friendly and accessible. One of the greatest parts of teaching is creating that class community and norms like we were talking about, and showing our personalities. So that can be difficult to do in like this digital platform. So videos and pre-recordings really should be no longer than 3 to 4 minutes at a time, and having informal opportunities to reveal your personality, enthusiasm for what you do. Students will appreciate that if videos are not perfect, as we know. You know, they keep the key to keeping students engaged and motivated is building those relationships. So don't be afraid to show your personality, because studies do show that you get better results when you are open and transparent about what's going on in your own life. Of course, not every lesson or direct instruction can be done in 3 to 4 minutes, right? So we want to chunk those times out to allow for separate modules if it requires longer time. And then making assignments meaningful. We've been talking about this because there is so much chaos. So what kids are having to do should be meaningful and purposeful and tie back to what's going on. Assignments, social emotional learning, it's the process through which all our children and adults understand and manage emotions. And the standards and skills in English pair so well with the arts, as we were saying. So teaching students how to use the arts as a resource for managing stress or any emotions can really help develop that stronger communication skills. Self-efficacy for students is so important. So remembering to build in time for students to work on personal goals and plans, and then acknowledging the achievement of those goals. That can be something that teachers really, really can support. So using the arts and music to build emotional vocabulary can promote effective communicators. And the link here will take you to the Virginia Department of Education page for social emotional learning resources to dive in deeper. So again, thinking about meaningful assignments, connect them to text and other content. Best practices, engage a culturally responsive approach to instruction. So as you see here, culturally responsive teaching is research-based, putting at the forefront meaningful connections between what students learn in school and their culture's language and life experiences. So the goal of culturally responsive teaching is really to develop that higher level academic thinking and connect in-school learning to their lives outside of the classroom. And so in this time of learning in place, whatever that looks like, the potential for students to be learning in various and multiple places, blending the classroom and home is more prevalent than it's ever been. So it's important to include representation of culture and language in the learning. And some more strategies for success. So how do I plan meaningful experiences for remote learning? Well, getting to know our students and what motivates them. Again, ensuring that they know why they are participating in the learning or in an activity will provide motivation and that investment that we really want them to have. And make sure that students are setting goals and they understand the norms of the class. That really is time well spent in this, in this environment, and incorporating voice and choice and agency whenever possible in the learning process and the products. And that visible learning, students will be much more engaged when they understand the process. So like John Hattie suggests, meaningful intentions can help connect students with goals of the learning and communicating the success criteria so that students can check for themselves what they are meeting, that they are meeting that criteria. So feedback should be ongoing, meaningful, and remember to plan for that part of the process when creating schedules and routines. And backwards planning, that is always best practice. And in virtual learning, allowing students to walk through that process can be helpful in allowing them to see the big picture and purpose for learning. So let students know what they need to be able to do by the end of the lesson. And then be sure to include how they will show that, what they know or what they need additional support with. Planning for how you will communicate the success criteria is key too. Will it be a checklist, a rubric, a to-do list of activities to reach that success? Always be transparent. That is key with students, and how they will learn, what they will learn, and why it's important for them to know that. And remember to check for understanding early and often. You know, that can be something that really can help us determine if students are grasping the material. That's something that we check for, those little cues in person. And so what are ways that you were looking for that in this new platform of maybe a hybrid or whatever the case may be? Is it a thumbs up? Is it a raised hand in a Zoom call? Just putting into place some strategies for checking understanding. And then finally, let's recap for learning. You know, how do I make learning visible in a remote setting? So, you know, for success, ongoing feedback, teacher to student helps promote community, definitely. And, you know, setting the success for criteria so that the students know what is going on, why they're doing it, and how they're going to be successful. Those are the what, why, and how of success with visible learning. And now I'm going to turn it back to Carmen for instruction.
We wanted to share just some considerations to keep in mind as you all are planning for your divisions, for your schools, and for your students and families. So these are 6 principles for supporting students with unfinished learning. This comes from a report from the Council on Great City Schools. They have, it's a whole very long report, but it discusses math, and there's also language arts included there, and all kinds of strategies and the principles and best practices for unfinished learning. So when thinking about what instruction students missed last year, this report will be helpful. We linked it there for you, but just to kind of go over some just basic principles, and we've shared this before, I think, but sticking to that grade level content, not using this as a review year, but really sticking to the content of the grade level that you are in, and then building in those scaffolds as you go. Of what students may have missed, and kind of build in from there. Focus on the depth of instruction, not on the pace. Prioritize content and learning. Really think about what are those big concepts that you need to build for students that are going to help them with all the other things they need to learn, and prioritize those things first. And ensure inclusion for all learners, identifying and addressing those gaps in learning, kind of like what we said with number 1. And then capitalize on what we have in common and not our differences, really taking this time now to figure out what are those similarities that we can build on, and not what all that is different, that we don't have this in our house, we don't have this, but what is it that we can all use? So think some considerations for planning at the beginning of the year, really thinking about just building student-family relationships. Your year will go so much easier. Literacy will be so much more meaningful if you know the families and the students that you're working with and have that relationship. The motivation will be that much more meaningful. And then really thinking about daily schedules and task cues, having that daily schedule posted somewhere. Where is it going to be posted? If it's in a packet, make sure it's at the front and center of the packet that's being sent home. If it's over the internet, make sure it's somewhere on a link or a login page that students can access easily and that they see every day. That routine is huge for students. And then task cues for younger students, using picture clues or something that will help, symbols for what time of the day it is, something that will help them access it easily. And if you're doing a hybrid model, making sure you have the same schedule posted in school as they do on their virtual place at home. Thinking about student responses. I know a lot of you are doing this right now, but thinking about how you want students to respond to you, whether you're in a Zoom setting or whether it's a phone call or whether you have that hybrid model. How do you want students to respond, and taking time to practice that over and over? What are your live communication routines going to be? Are you going to communicate at certain times of the day? Are you going to communicate certain times of the week? Thinking about other communication routines. How will you talk with families electronically? How will you talk with families over the phone? If you don't have that, that virtual mode, how will you have build some other communication routines. Will families know to expect your phone call every Friday? Will they know that you have Zoom every morning at 9 o'clock? Just kind of thinking through those routines. And access to anchor charts, student resources, and other visual scaffolds. I mean, everyone is heartbroken that we can't have students within those four walls of the classroom, but think about what all belongs on those four walls of the classroom. Those are often huge scaffolds that we don't have, that we're always just pointing to and are at the ready that we need. And how can we build those four walls with whatever mode we are using? So anchor charts, if you have anchor charts that you build with students, be building those anchor charts with them, but then how can they have access to those later on? Do we need to think about, are we going to take photographs for them and post them in whatever electronic mode we're using? I know a lot of you have content walls and sound walls now. And as we're building those, how can students have access to those every day? Whether it's, are we using a packet and we send a picture of it home, or kind of help the students add to it, or is it virtually and we can have a picture of it and post it somewhere where the students can click on it and you say, hey, go click on your sound wall. Whatever those resources are, making sure that you have time to build those in and that your students have access to those, even though they don't have it to look at on a wall. And then thinking about your English language learners, your students with special needs, really taking time to build in how will they have access to whatever you're teaching. It may be a little extra conference or pre-teaching some vocabulary or whatever it is, making sure that they are included in the learning. And then using assessments. So think about connect with the prior year, look through their records, connect with those teachers, think about that unfinished learning, and ask what the unfinished learning was. We have linked here the video English tracking logs that'll be helpful for that hopefully you can kind of see what was addressed, and we think, yeah, that they were on track with that as far as addressing the content, or hey, we just did not get a chance to hit this. So those are helpful for that. Taking those screening assessments, whatever information you can get from those screening assessments, planning for instruction using those, using some informal observations, even if it's on a Zoom call or a phone call with families, just kind of learning all that you can about what the student's been doing and where they are in their learning. Interviews with families are huge. They've been spending so much time with their students and they can tell you a lot about kind of where they are in their learning. And then we're just recording that information, taking all the notes that you can on the students and kind of using that to plan. Using the standards and pacing, we've linked the curriculum framework here for you, but also thinking about your own divisions, pacing and scope and sequence, and any modifications that might have been made to that scope and sequence. Thinking about some of your school divisions started 2 weeks later than normal. So really thinking about any modifications that might have been made because of that, and then planning for that missed content. So we have teacher talk here because Colleen addressed earlier about videos and how short videos need to be. But in order to kind of keep those videos short, we really need to plan out our teacher talk. Think about what you want to say. Think about what students need to know and be able to do, and write a little script for yourself. Be concise, pre-plan that to keep it short. We don't have as much time with students as normal, so planning out teacher talk and being explicit with that talk is going to be very important in a virtual setting. We did have a question about kind of motivation and keeping independent readers motivated as the year goes, and a lot of that kind of tied in with planning, but just some other things to think about when you're planning for that motivational piece are allowing for planning for choice of reading, planning for choice of research topics, having students share what they're reading just every now and then. Maybe some of you all are having those morning meetings or afternoon meetings, maybe have one person a week kind of share what they're reading independently. Goal setting independently, kind of talking or however mode of communication that you have, setting goals with your students and having those check-ins to make sure that they are achieving those goals. Having them be part of the thematic topic development, brainstorming, if it's even electronically and type in what you want, or brainstorming live, having them kind of develop that topic with you, providing feedback, immediate feedback, whether it's live, written, making sure it's timely, having those scaffolds available, allowing students the choice of maybe how they share. Would you like to act out your story? Would you like to draw? So planning for maybe some choices that you could provide all year long for students. And then planning for that conferring piece. What do you blog? Were you going to blog with students about what they're reading, talking over the phone or Zoom? So just kind of planning about what are those structures that you're going to have all year to have students keep them motivated in what they're reading and researching and writing. So then while you're planning, just a reminder to kind of stop by that PALS website. I've heard of a lot of people calling and chatting with them to try to brainstorm a little bit about how to make it work, and they've been very helpful in that. So we just wanted to share, these are some screenshots of some resources, but feel free to connect with them if you are kind of working this through in your division as well. So then to kind of round us out, we're going to think about, since we've talked about some best practices, we've talked about methods for virtual learning, what are the areas that we are going to focus on this school year? So we've learned so much, but what are we going to focus on? And we always kind of start with our Code Virginia to help us with that. But just as a reminder, in kindergarten and grade 3, we're really focusing on reading, writing, spelling, and mathematics. And that the bulk of our learning time is really spent in those 4 academic disciplines of English, math, science, history, and social science. So hopefully that helps with a lot. I know there's a lot of, we feel like there's a lot that we need to focus on with students, but really spending the bulk of our time in those areas, and in K3, reading, writing, and spelling. And that we're focusing on those strands and those communication, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And that at the minimum in K3, we're focusing on phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary development, text comprehension. So really, when you're planning, thinking about at the minimum, how can we hit those things virtually? And then as we continue, this has some quotes about phonics instruction, but just remember, just thinking about, in elementary and early elementary, how can we hit that phonics instruction? That a lot of our literacy time is spent in that, along with exposing them to good literature, building that background knowledge, and helping them kind of just talk about what they're reading. So just a reminder about how important phonics instruction is at the early elementary level on up into when they're learning multisyllabic words. And then what are we focusing on? We're going to focus on being explicit and systematic, telling students what we want them to know. We don't have a lot of time with them. Just like we don't have a lot of time left with you all today, but telling them what we want them to know, being explicit, moving from simple to more complex tasks. And I am going to let, and then I think I'm going to let Jill talk a little bit about developing rich English tasks, and then kind of just thinking about what are some areas of focus for all learners.
Thank you, Carmen. Yes, and this is actually a document that we are going to link with the PowerPoint in the recorded webinar on the same page as the rest of the literacy webinar. So you'll be able to see this in all its full glory. It's about 3 pages. But this is just a tool to help you develop the remote implementation of rich English language arts tasks and what that looks like, and how to do this in a remote environment, and how to support students through these tasks that are far more comprehensive, and kind of integrate all of the strands and skills, and think about what you can do just as a support. I know that math and I believe science and history have also, or have either created these or are in the process of creating these as well, because there might be some opportunities for interdisciplinary situations here. But in terms of what rich English language arts tasks could look like in a remote learning environment, and what the components would be, and how to set these up for student success, that's just a document that we will link to with all of the webinar materials for your use. English supervisors have already had access to this as well, but we do have an accessible version that we will be posting on the website too. So just to kind of wrap things up, because I know we're over, but just remember that kind of narrowing it down here. We want to build relationships. We want to give students access to grade level content and text, keeping in mind that the English team here has an entire section of our website dedicated to learning in place resources and finding free accessible texts for all students on a variety of platforms. It's there for parents, it's there for caregivers, it's there for instructional leaders. So please know that all of those materials are available to you. Thinking about rich English tasks, how we can include all learners in this strange situation, and then how we create predictable reading and writing routines so that our students know what we expect of them and can be successful, meet your expectations, and move on to what they need to learn next. They can show you what they've learned. And then just really emphasizing those foundational skills in kindergarten through third grade, and creating not only an engaging and inviting environment for our students, but building those relationships with their adult caregivers who are kind of almost like your instructional assistants at home. And how can we make meaningful relationships there and connect with those people who are doing the bulk of what we would hopefully want to do in the classroom if we were all together. So how can we lean on them and work together to create a situation where all of our students can excel? I just want to remind you that we do have a few more webinars coming up, and several more will be added to this list as soon as we get that website updated. But specifically, we're going to be looking at social and emotional learning and reading for elementary school students next week, social emotional learning and reading for secondary students the following week. And this next one will be a big one. It's going to be the assessment supports for this school year when we're talking about our grades 3 through 8 and end of course reading SOL test, which as of right now is still scheduled to happen on time. So please tune in for that one if you haven't already registered. And then we will explore how to integrate the 4 strands in a hybrid model, as potentially more schools may find themselves back in school for a couple of days a week as we move closer to the holidays. So just want to say here are some of the additional resources we have. These are all links that will be provided with the materials. And this is our contact information. And I apologize that we've gone over. There's always so much more we could say, but we appreciate those of you who stuck it out to the end. And feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions. We will get the materials posted as soon as possible, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.